Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest edition of MozFest Dialogues and Debates. I'm Justin O'Kelly at Mozilla, and this is our series of discussions on the big issues around trustworthy tech, AI, big tech, and similar topics. Today, for the next 14 minutes, we're going to be discussing pride, the internet, and the pandemic, with some highly talented activists, researchers, and technologists from the LGBTQIA+ community, essentially looking at how the pandemic has affected their work, how their work has intersected with the pandemic. And if you haven't already submitted a question, you can do so using the hashtag dialogues and debates by tweeting at Mozilla, and we'll try and get to one or two of your questions during what I think will be a really informative and entertaining 3/4 of an hour. So we're in the second year of this pandemic, and this is a month, particularly here in the US, where we traditionally celebrate our pride in queer communities, but we're also reflecting on the struggles of those that have survived the pandemic so far in our second year. Especially as it relates to being online, because sometimes the internet has made it better, and for some people, it's made it worse. And even as cities like Portland in Oregon are looking at opening up again here in the US, Taiwan is experiencing its worst outbreak yet, and the Delta variant is causing problems globally, including in Portugal and the UK. So what does it mean to be proud and queer in 2021 online? And how are our communities living through some of this? So let me introduce our guests today. From France, Soudeh Rad is co-chair of ILGA-Europe, the NGO fighting for LGBTQ rights in Europe and Central Asia. Soudeh is also co-founder of Spectrum, a queer feminist organization advocating for equality. From New York, Shaka McLaughlin, professor of media studies and anthropology at SUNY Purchase. Shaka is also chair of Purchase's Gender Studies and Global Black Studies programs. Peeks Craft in London leads the Creative Computing Institute at University of the Arts London. Peeks works at the intersection of creativity and computational technologies. And Nim Ralph is a trans activist and freelance writer, trainer, and facilitator. They campaign actively for queer and trans rights and have organized around issues related to anti-racism, disability, in the environment. Welcome to everyone. So most of our discussion today will focus on the pandemic, but first of all, let's give everyone an idea of your background. Can each of you tell us a bit about your larger body of work at the intersection of these LGBTQIA+ issues in the internet? Soudeh, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. Especially in this Pride Month. ILGA-Europe is an NGO based in Brussels, but part of the bigger ILGA World NGO, which is the biggest association defending the LGBTQIA+ human rights in the world. And Europe and Central Asia is covered by the ILGA-Europe NGO. And our members are organizations that directly the individuals. So what we're doing in ILGA-Europe, and mostly the staff is doing, me as the co-chair of the executive board, I'm just there to support and support the staff and the beautiful work that they're doing. We're supporting the movement. We're also making sure the human rights of the LGBTQI people in Europe and Central Asia is improving. Of course, some countries are better, some countries are really not moving forward. And among that, we're doing also other support. We're providing some support for the movement as well, not directly to the individuals most of the time. And also in Spectrum, which I am the co-founder of, we are very much focused on the Persian speaker LGBTQIA community, and we are promoting equality, love, and fairness. And that's why we are focusing on Persian, because Persian is one of those languages spoken in the countries like Iran, of course, and also Afghanistan and Tajikistan, where you really do not hear about the human rights of LGBTQI people and women and other underrepresented groups. So this is what we're doing. And me as a person, Iranian person based in Europe, as a member of diaspora, internet has always been like oxygen. So we are using this tool to promote the human rights, and we're mostly doing what cannot be done in a certain country, or we can do the best using the freedom of speech we have relatively. where we are based on and using internet technology.
Thank you. And Peaks, would you like to go next? Your focus.
Sure, thanks. I'm currently a lecturer and a researcher at the University of the Arts London and the new Creative Computing Institute there, where I lead a master's degree in internet equalities. And that degree focuses on exploring how power relations are organized, embedded, and perpetuated in internet technologies and how they can be challenged through critical, creative, and activist practice. And I come from a computer science background, but have pretty much left that behind, and I'm now, I don't know, just railing on big tech and pissing off my bosses and things like that.
And I think we're all intrigued by the motto playfulness as resistance behind you, so we'd love to come back to that. But staying in the UK, Nim, we'd love to hear from you about your focus too.
Thanks, yeah, and great to be here too. Thanks for having me. I think my focus is predominantly as a campaigner and activist, organising with queer, trans and intersex people of colour in the UK and across Europe. And then in the last few years, particularly with trans communities, as we've seen a huge mobilisation of anti-trans hostility and coordinated attacks on trans people, particularly in the UK, but globally as part of the cultural wars. And aside from that, I also train and support activists and campaigners globally around movement building and campaign strategy, which has always been partially online and partially in person. And so I'd say in terms of the intersection of the internet, I think working or organising in parts of the LGBTQIA plus community, of whom we aren't geographically many, the internet has always been a huge part of community building and creating space and challenging isolation and resources together, and particularly with a focus on disability justice and being part of communities for whom that's really important. I think that's always been there and laid a foundation for our communities, which has got much worse in the last year plus throughout the pandemic. I think the other way that the internet has intersected is that the kind of culture wars in many ways are very narrative driven. And I think that the internet is a kind of location and a tool through which a lot of the attacks on trans people, or a lot of the narrative around trans people, are tested, tried and delivered. And I say tested really intentionally because I think something that's happened in the last year a lot with the UK government is that they've leaked possible policies about trans people in Sunday papers and waited to see what the internet backlash is before they decide whether or not they're going to stand by the policy. And so in terms of the intersection of the internet with this work, I'd say there's kind of all sorts of ways that it intersects that we'll get more into as we talk.
It's fascinating. Shaka, last but not least, tell us more about your focus there as it's changed, if it's changed at all in the last year and a half through the pandemic.
Sure. So I am a kind of sci-fi and fantasy blurred. I've always been interested in the relationship between technology and identity. And so when I started grad school in 1989, I began looking at queerness and the web with a special kind of emphasis on what the internet afforded queer people and our identities. And so since then, I've continued to conduct research on the ways that the internet and queer identities, especially as they articulate with race, kind of productively entangle one another. Sorry, this is a new cat.
Love to talk about the cat in the room.
I write about everything from porn to social media to contemporary art. But ultimately, I'm really interested in like kind of two things that go together. So I'm interested in intimacy. I'm interested in the affective, the sexual, the political, and what in the academy, some people might call like worldings, right? Like all of the labors and processes by which we collectively produce forms of culture and sociality. And so, yeah, for me, the internet, I think, just to echo what I think Nim and Soudeh said too, is that the internet kind of was our routes for like queer diaspora, like one kind of queer diaspora came through the internet. And then certainly thinking about it as this incredibly powerful locus, both for forms of queer cultural production, and I would say more recently, these just horrible campaigns of anti-queer, anti-trans violence as well. And so, yeah, so I think that the internet is and has been and always will be queer.
I love that you touched on the intimacy there, because we were talking before we came online today about the pressure that some of us feel in different parts of the world to get offline and meet up with friends we haven't seen or colleagues we haven't seen for a long time. And I think that is one of the lasting, is going to be one of the lasting legacies of the pandemic, that this sometimes unspoken fear that we are now doing something that we declared was dangerous just maybe a few weeks before, a few days before, in some cases. And I think the queer communities, particularly in the West, have long looked to pride as the moment that if they weren't normally extrovert, they would summon up their extrovert energy to get out of the house, to join up, to join hands, and to celebrate being queer. But that's not obvious this year. We were talking about how it's definitely not obvious in London right now. And I'm curious about how your own communities, your friends and your colleagues have adapted to the pandemic, and whether your own personal communities that existed offline, so I want to just stay in the personal for the moment, whether they've struggled to move online, your personal experiences of that. If I could start with you first, Soudeh.
Sure, but first of all, I would remind ourselves that 50% of the world population is not connected at all at first place, and that internet for many, many people is just a luxury, and it's not like everyday accessibility. And that includes many, many countries that are suffering from theocratic regimes that are basically on daily, regular basis violating their human rights, and that is because of violating the access to information. We saw this loss of the sense of the community and connectivity during the pandemic, especially during the first months in Eastern Europe, for instance, or in Russia, for instance, and also, of course, in Iraq, in Iran, in Pakistan, in northern African countries. We saw that a lot because people could just come together, join each other offline, as you said, and just without really chatting or just having this internet issue, they would just give a call and just get together. And that would make them the community they had the idea of. And then all of a sudden, pandemic comes and they cannot get out of their houses and they don't have access to internet, or if they do have access to internet, they don't know how to connect. And that basically was a very hard time, in my experience at least, during the first months of pandemics. It's almost 1.5 years, I can't believe it, that people had to learn again to build this community, find each other, and understanding what is happening there.
And being online, sorry. I was just going to say, it's not necessarily safer to be online than to be offline.
Exactly. Because also in the countries, and when I say countries, it's not only out of the US, even in the US, for one person, I'm just picking maybe the most obvious trans example, let's say, it's not easy to come out as trans online while they know the neighbors might not be fine with it. So it's everywhere. It's not only farther east or like, I don't know, in Middle East or in other countries. It can also be just your neighbor who has this same problem, not coming online because it's not safe for them. We have seen a lot of blackmailing. We even got to a homophobic attack, which ended up by murdering a gay person in Iran during the pandemic, just a couple of weeks before he could flee Iran to Turkey to seek asylum. And I would also like to mention that many people who had already seeking asylum, like asylum seekers in Turkey, for instance, had to stay in that country because the final countries did not open their doors to them. Like European countries have not accepted any foreigners coming to the countries. Australia has closed its borders, and that meant for them, they could not have the community offline, they could not have the community online either, because as an asylum seeker in Turkey, for instance, you do not have the right to work and you don't have the income to pay for your internet. So it's been a huge attack, let's say, to mental health and the connectivity in the community in whatever way we're gonna think of. We should also mention that people, LGBTQI people, are not only a member of LGBTQI community, as we all know, they also have other identities. And I'm going to talk about the people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, sex workers. Every single other indicator that is added to that layer of identity adds multiple times of discrimination and reduces the accessibility to connectivity, which means also the community. And community for these people is the most important part, because they understand the identity, they get to be proud of themselves. And in many, many cases, they understand what normal means and what it doesn't mean. And basically normal is weird. They will understand that they should be proud of themselves.
Yeah. Nim, to what degree do you think in the UK we take for granted that it is safe or safer to be online as a member of one of our communities in this time? Than the countries that Soudeh is talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Soudeh's point that, like, I don't think this is a kind of other or outside kind of binary is really true, because I think that it's completely contextual to your local community, like I think there's a duality, I think, in trans experience this year, not to kind of binarize it too much, of an initial relief of not having to go outside. And I certainly felt that, a kind of gender euphoria of not having to interact with transphobia, and just being able to be yourself at home and not observed or have people's ideas of you forced onto you all the time. Simultaneously, there's loads of, one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is the kind of increasing, not just the impact of the last year on mental health, but also on domestic violence rates, and the number of LGBT people in the UK and elsewhere who aren't safe at home, and so who haven't been able to access, virtually or otherwise, things like an event like this, or support services, because there's no safe way to do that without other people at home finding out, which is where danger and violence most often is. And then you add on to that the kind of digital divide that Soudeh also pointed out around who has access to technology in the first place and who doesn't. And in the UK system, there was a massive push in the first lockdown that we had around in solidarity with asylum seekers, and particularly LGBTQI plus asylum seekers who had no access to mobile devices and no access to internet. And so when we're talking about that question, I think it's completely contextual to who we're talking about. And
right.
Yeah.
But it could feel, I would imagine, I love that you brought that up. It could feel a little hopeless to want to try and show solidarity with people that you can't meet offline and they can't find you online. It's been a lonely year for a lot of people. Peaks, I wonder if you could talk about what you feel has been kind of lost or gained within your own community online as a result of the last year and a half.
Yeah, thanks. And really thankful to hear Soudeh and Nim's points, both bringing their really hugely international perspectives, as well as the UK digital divide too, which is worth being mindful about. And on the point about the internet and luxury, when the pandemic first started, I was just completely mind boggled that, like, I was working in a university setting, not the university I'm at now, and I was just like what I'm doing, this work is useless. Like the higher education, like I know, like these people, these Oxford students, like they aren't, like why am I working right now? Like why is the department head telling us to keep working? Like and I don't know, I mean it took me a couple of months to get past that, but I still think it's just I wish that I hadn't, I wish that I still had that, like that sense of reality of when it all was first starting, and just as, because it's just as scary now as it was then, but it's hard for me to like have those same emotions now.
Yeah.
I think in terms of how it impacted myself, my I guess that's how it impacted myself, but my communities and how I participate in those. One thing I noticed is that I was involved in like several campaigns and activist groups at the time, and pretty much I think like all of them just stopped. Some of them had already been meeting online. Some of them had been meeting in person and struggled to make that transition. Some of them started doing mutual aid work, or like people went off and focused on mutual aid work instead of whatever other causes they're working on. But it was just striking to me that there was so much of a shift in how work was being done. That also then changed again with the murder of George Floyd and over the summer, which yeah, I guess reprioritized a lot for me and the groups that I was in touch with. That all is kind of, I would say, more on the negative end, but on the positive side, it has been really interesting, and again, a great privilege and luxury to be able to just attend events like all over the world. I don't know, there are challenges still with that, like not meeting in person. I haven't learned how to do my like rackets properly or anything. Like I don't actually, but yeah, those are my reflections.
Thank you. And Shaka, I don't know if you've been in New York through the pandemic, but obviously it's been the crucible, or the fire in which the pandemic was forged here in the US. I would love to hear from you as well about how your own community has survived or been affected by the last year and a half, online in particular.
I mean, I think like so many other teachers, everyone was just exhausted, like just exhausted, from having to perform in some version of the way we're doing now, but for hours and hours and hours every week. And then, so I think that, and then I actually live at the college. Like, so it's sort of like I thought of it like a spaceship or as a bubble in Westchester County, kind of where the X-Men are from, actually, for those of you nerds out there. And so like Greenwich, Connecticut borders us on one side, and Harrison, which is a super ultra wealthy, you don't even see the house because it's so far back. And so my partner and I, we were here on this campus, which was empty. Thousands of people live here normally, and there were 25 people. So, we dealt with the isolation. For me, I was calling people and Zooming and FaceTiming with my friends all the time because it was really necessary. But a lot of my friends who are in the city, which is, 25 miles, just 25 miles from here, I can, they were like, they had to move because they lived down the street from a hospital. I had friends who sort of expressed similar things to Nim. There was a kind of gender euphoria, both amongst cis women and trans folks, in that, like, you wear sunglasses, a hat, and a mask, and a poncho. It's like you're good to go. You don't have to worry about being catcalled. But I think that what I would just want to underscore is a couple of things. Like, one is that queerness has always been networked. Right? Doesn't mean it was digitally networked, but it's always been networked. Like how we learn about each other and how we connect to one another, it's always been networked. And queers have had to build those networks because there was no queer, infrastructure set up for us like that. So we built that. And the other thing that I think, especially for people, for a lot of people globally, having to live always in the back of your head with the threat of a virus is not new. So I did find myself, I behaved in responsible ways, but I took risks that friends of mine were like, I would never. You had someone over like for dinner in July of last year. It's like, yeah, we like didn't see anyone for 2 weeks and neither did they. And then we saw each other. It was great. They spent the night. It was fantastic. So I think that those ideas that we create networks, that those networks have some resiliency, and that as queer people, especially when it comes around intimacy, we have a tolerance for risk that I think other people that I think will lead us to reflecting in years to come about how we as queer people related to this virus differently. Right?
One of the things I definitely, picking up on that, found very difficult to grok in my head was having lived through the beginning of the AIDS pandemic, when people would some people would don masks and gloves out of ignorance, and rightly were called out for it because they stigmatized those who didn't even have HIV or AIDS. Now here all of a sudden, if you didn't wear a mask, and some people were wearing gloves as well in service industries, you were called out for being ignorant. It was really hard to mentally kind of sort these two truths.
Well, the social protest movements of the last few years, right? Like cities since before in other countries, like France has very interesting rules around this. Canada has interesting rules about, like, you're not supposed to wear a mask in public in a group. They made it illegal, right? After these social protests, after Occupy, after the student movements in Quebec, like 4 or 5 years back, they basically, like, you cannot gather politically in public and wear masks, and now, like, this might be a new affordance for us, like there could be some political potentiality there of reclaiming anonymity, and anonymity in public.
Any thoughts from the others on that point? Nim? I'm picking on you. I just think it's a really interesting, evolving subject.
Not just anonymity, but like appearance too. Like, you don't have to put on so much makeup if you got the mask on.
Yeah. Well, listen, we had a question from the audience from Jenny Olson, who asks, and I'd love any of you to take this that wants it, whether you would offer any impressions or ideas around social media safety or lack thereof. Jenny helped GLAD launch the LGBTQ Social Media Safety Index program in May, which is dedicated to platform accountability, something we care a lot about at Mozilla. Soudeh, I'll come to you first if you like. I have no idea, for example, and I should, but how smart it is to share your experiences of being part of our community on Facebook in Iran, if that's even possible. And, like, do you have any thoughts around social media safety as we move forward to this?
Yeah, Justin, it is not safe.
Right.
And it is not safe only in Iran, but also in other countries. As we just picked the example, this can happen anywhere. If this happens in Iran, if this happens in Russia, this can happen anywhere. And blackmailing is the very easiest, the simplest thing that can happen to you. We in Spectrum have been working on that very specific issue with focusing on digital hygiene and not digital safety or security for the LGBTQ community, Persian speakers, but also other underrepresented communities. I don't like to use the marginalized community because marginalized makes it like, we are victims of something. We are not. We have been underrepresented in different communities. And that is because we did not have access to education on many levels, but also the platforms have not been created for us. Like Facebook has not been created for the queer community. And I'm pretty sure everyone remembers this gender identity choices that we did not have on Facebook. And all of a sudden we had 1,000 of them, and then no one cared all of a sudden. And then they're moving it somehow that no one really sees what your pronouns are. And now we have to put it next to our name. So it's a whole thing. It's a daily battle, basically, to be yourself, how you want to be on social media and on internet as it is in the real life or like offline life. Every day you wear something, you come out. You are performing somehow. And we have art professors here that I'm not going to go farther in that, but that's the same in social media. Only some people think social media is not real. So they don't really think about the hygiene on social media. And what we're doing, we're focusing on this to make sure that people are considering the risks that they might take coming out or sharing their stories on social media, and just have a free choice of doing it or not. And the very simple example that we give, or I give usually during the trainings, is that, well, you go to the bathroom, there is no soap, then you remember if you want to have an apple, then you just remember that you have not washed your hands with the soap. Before or after Corona pandemic is the same. And that is the hygiene. That is the level of understanding of what risks you're taking. We had so many cases of the dating apps being abused by people who basically started to chat with a member of LGBTQ community And that is not only in Iran. Again, it has also happened in France that like an gay Muslim man was basically found by other people in the Muslim community. And because of some reasons that many can understand, he had a very hard time and he had to run out of the family, run out of the house and seek asylum inside France and just change his identity on paper so to take shelter. So being really careful about what we share online is very important, and that is part of our everyday self-education, because things change all the time. Like I'm today on Facebook and tomorrow I go and see, oh my God, everything is out there. Same with Instagram, and nothing produced, no data produced, I think, is safe these days. No data on your phone. So when I'm taking pictures or selfies, I'm just thinking of, am I going to create this data or not? So it's not about sharing it here and there. We had, again, cases in many cases in Chechnya, as you remember. It had made its way to the news, if I can say. Also in that country, people had used a lot of internet connections and finding people who have been chatting and online dating applications. I would also like that to say that many dating applications like Grindr, for instance, has a very good program taking care of the safety of the individuals that are using the application, and not only by telling them, hey, you're entering a country where same-sex sexual conduct, even with consent, can be punishable, but also to make sure that the pictures should not be selfies, etc., etc. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, yes, no, thank you.
I mean, I would just add in there too, and I think Nim could say something about this too. I mean, just the first thing is, what's the threat? Like the contextual, the situation is, the context is always going to be so crucial. So the question is always like, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of your family, the police, the government, the corporation? You should be like, all of them are potential. But if you're, and it's going to vary for different people, right?
Nim, you said something last July that I found while I was getting ready for this, that I'm amazed at, in some ways, that the ray of light that you shone upon the situation. You were talking to Gay Times, and I'm quoting you: "We must take heed from anti-trans feminists. Trauma begets trauma. Let this be a lesson to all of us to find joy in our activism and not let our fear consume us." When you apply that to your own journey and beyond the pandemic, where are you finding joy right now in your activism? It seems like it might be hard to the outsider.
It's absolutely hard. It's been a whole year since I wrote that. Yeah, no, and I actually think when reflecting on that question, like thinking about the year that it's been, and how unrelenting it has been for everybody in so many different ways, I think that there's both sadness and joy in even reflecting on that very question, I think, of kind of what we've continued to build and do together, and the kind of trauma that we've all survived in the past year differently and together. So yeah, where is their joy? I think I think the single biggest thing, honestly, is actually just the sheer. I was quite disillusioned in terms of movement building in the UK at the beginning of last year, and I think not just in the UK but globally, the sheer amount of organisation and coordination and rejuvenation of movements. Sometimes, for absolutely traumatic reasons in the case of George Floyd, but the sheer resistance and coming together of people, even though that's been made so much harder for us, I think is really a testament of a joy, and something that I derive much joy from, and including very specifically the ways that mutual aid has had a real resurgence in the last 18 months, and the care, not just in our own communities, but cross communities, and a kind of re-recognition of the resources and futures and visions that we share together, and the organising of ourselves around those, I think has been really joyful for me.
I love that. And as we get close to the end of our discussion, I'd love to just put the same question to all of you. Shaka, where do you find joy at this point in your work as you look forward?
It's a funny thing. I certainly in the solidarity activisms, in the kind of, we have more social movements happening right now than at any time in human history. Like, that's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. More people are involved in it than at any time in human history. Great thing. I'm a tenured, like, Black queer professor on sabbatical. So like my number one joy, activist joy currently, is refusal. Like, refusal to do that work. Like, I prefer not to. I prefer not to. I prefer not to. I prefer not to. So honestly, like, I'm deriving some real, I'm lucky to be in a place where the, restrictions don't really restrict how I can interact with people. I travel to see my family. I'm just trying to give myself a little, like, time to heal and to look at even the ways that my students refused to do work while this was happening as a form of political intelligence and political activity, that refusal, whether it's to work for institutions that are kind of constantly working against our flourishing, or it's giving our labor for free, or too much energy even to our besties. Mm-hmm. So for right now, I think for me, the joyous activism is no.
I love that. Peaks, I'd love to put the same question to you.
I'm just gonna say the same thing as Shaka. I don't know, like I've been I think this last year and a half, 2 years now has just revealed, like, not revealed, but just emphasized how like places that I've worked, at least, certainly don't work for me, and only care about me to the extent that that I'm, serving their business model. And so, yeah, I work part-time now, trying to have my 4-day weekends every week, just like skating a lot. I love skating. Trying to deprogram my capitalist workaholism.
And introduce more self-care, by the sound of it, into your life. I love that. Soudeh, where you are in the middle of France, I think a small village in France. How do you?
Yes, I am in process, let's say, of moving into a very small village in France, and that started exactly like the day we had the first lockdown in France. I just moved back to this farm. That is on my personal level. I also stopped working with the bigger, beautiful NGO. With nothing to say, but I really needed some calm for myself to take care of my body, first of all, which was diagnosed with an autoimmune not long time ago. But the joy I find is not only in nature, is not only in what I see, not in my dogs, etc., but it's really in this sense of kind of waking up of the world. Like, I see more and more people paying more attention to the environment and just listening more to underrepresented people and community stories, because at some point, pandemic news was all over the news, and you couldn't hear anything other than that. And then there was this sense of fatigue of this news. So the journalists had this creativity of just going for their business model, right? Just to keep the business running, just going to find the stories that have been less heard. And I think this has brought everybody in this world to a sense of like waking up and saying, what are you doing? I don't want to call it awakening, but I hope this continues to happen. And also post-pandemic, we continue taking care of each other as we are doing now. Like, we are just connecting to this Zoom calls every day, I don't know, 100 times. And the first 10 minutes is just really checking in. How are you? I do not really recall if we used to do that in person. We just say, hey, you look fine. And then we were not even waiting for the answer. How are you? Fine. And how are you? That was really automatic. But now there is this personal connection between people, but also between the communities. And I love that. And that truly gives me this joy of whatever work we have been doing, and it has not resulted in anything, or it has come to something really positive. It is continuing. And I'm really looking back to, or looking forward rather, to the next generations to just move on and be really louder than we were. I'm 40, by the way. So I'm really looking forward. This really gives me joy.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Indeed, we can all look forward to being able to be louder at some point, but also take the time to switch off and get offline as well when we need to, because that is an act of self-care. who knows, hopefully this time next year, we'll be having a very different conversation based on some of the things that are in motion in all of your places today. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today to Dialogues and Debates. You can continue the conversation with the hashtag Dialogues and Debates on Twitter. We are at Mozilla. And I'd like to thank Shaka and Nim and Peaks and Soudeh very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was great to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
for hosting us.
Thank you.